I believe it's customary to make a declaration of interest at the beginning of any talk, so I shall make a declaration of interest. I have participated actively in 2 referendum campaigns. The first was in 2004 here in Cyprus. I campaigned in favour of a no vote, but I didn't have a vote here in Cyprus as a British citizen. And on the second occasion I became actively involved in a referendum campaign was this year, in fact over the last few weeks, in relation to Scotland. And I had no vote there either, even though I was a British citizen. So let me just lay my cards on the table straight away. Scotland, ladies and gentlemen, and there, hopefully if I can make there it is. Scotland, which is the northern part of the United Kingdom, may be situated in northwest Europe and form part of an island. But in more ways than one, Scotland has nonetheless left its imprint on the Eastern Mediterranean, and indeed vice versa. Now, I could spend an hour talking about the connections between Scotland and Cyprus, but I'll limit myself to just 40 to 45 minutes or so, and I'll just say this by way of introduction. Here in Cyprus, just think of the connections between Cyprus and Scotland. We have a coastal district of Larnaca known as Mackenzie Beach. The Troodos Mountains are graced by the Caledonian Falls, Caledonia being the ancient Roman name for Scotland. And everywhere you go in Cyprus, especially the bars and restaurants, you can drink fine Scotch whisky. As for the Scottish expats, that's those Scottish people who've left Scotland to live elsewhere, Cyprus is populated by large numbers of Scots, and I understand there's even a Caledonian Society of Cyprus. There's even, I understand, a shop in Paphos that sells kilts and other Scottish costumes. Now, I don't know if there's a shop in Edinburgh which sells the Vraga, the Cypriot costume, but Cypriots have nonetheless left their mark on Scotland. My godfather is here, and his son is an eminent surgeon, and indeed a consultant surgeon at a hospital in Edinburgh. Other Cypriots have left their mark as well. The most famous, perhaps, is Sir Stagis, the businessman who was heavily involved in property and hotels in Scotland. So there is a commercial and a professional connection between Scotland and Cyprus. Let me now just zoom in on the precise subject matter of this presentation. I'm going to skate over the recent constitutional history of Cyprus and then dwell on what I would call the 5 core lessons. There are others, but 5 core lessons of history that we can draw from the British experience in Scotland and apply here in Cyprus and indeed other parts of the European Union and beyond, for that matter, as well. First of all, the history. On Thursday, the 18th of September, that is to say last Thursday, a referendum was held in Scotland, but not in the rest of the United Kingdom. The referendum invited approximately 4.2 million registered voters to provide an answer to a seemingly straightforward question. The question was this: do you think that Scotland should be an independent country? In other words, if I can use Cypriot political terminology here, voters were given a stark choice between voting yes, with a view to procuring the partition of the United Kingdom by means of Scottish independence, or voting no, with a view to prolonging the 307-year-old union, or enosis, between Scotland and the United Kingdom. The referendum was planned to be determined in accordance with the principle of majoritarian democracy, that is to say, by a simple majority of voters in Scotland voting one way or the other. The official result was announced by the Chief Counting Officer for Scotland. Note the phrase, Chief Counting Officer for Scotland, not the Chief Counting Officer of the United Kingdom. The official result was to be announced, or was announced, by the Chief Counting Officer for Scotland on the morning of Friday the 19th of September last week. An astonishing total of 84.6% of eligible voters cast their votes. Of these, 1.6 million, or 44.7%, voted yes in favour of independence, and 2 million, or 55.3%, voted no, that is to say in favour of the maintenance of the United Kingdom. This was hailed by some as a reasonably decisive outcome in favour of the Union, but of course Mr Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party and outgoing First Minister of Scotland, stated that the Scottish nationalists had just fallen short of independence, but he heavily hinted that another opportunity might arise in the not too distant future. Now, I think it's important to understand how and why the Scottish referendum actually took place, because we can learn lessons from the mistakes that were made by the British political establishment across the three main parties, particularly in the Labour Party in the 1990s and 2000s, and more latterly by the Conservative Party in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. So let me sketch out the history. I would say at the very outset in terms of the history that the referendum and the related rise of Scottish nationalism, which preceded the referendum, were the byproducts, or what one might call the unintended consequences, of a radical and multi-dimensional programme of constitutional reform, which was introduced on a case-by-case, step-by-step basis by Tony Blair when he served as Prime Minister from 1997 until 2007. This programme included the establishment of what became known as devolved organs of government in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, pursuant to legislation dating from 1998. Now, what devolution means, I'll explain in more detail later, is not exactly the same as federation, but it's something similar to federation. It involves the transfer of power from the central organs of government in London to regional governments in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, but not England, interestingly enough, not England. Now, when the idea of transferring or devolving power from London to Scotland was first fleshed out and presented to Parliament in 1998, the then Labour government proclaimed that this act of devolution was also an act of democratisation. Now, we're all in favour of democracy, I hope, but as we'll discover, democracy can sometimes backfire on those who try and promote it. Now, as the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom has pointed out in a case known as Martin and Her Majesty's Advocate, the Scotland Act of 1998, which introduced devolution in Scotland, is on any view a monumental piece of constitutional legislation. Remember, in the United Kingdom we don't have a single book or booklet known as the British Constitution. We have a scattering of documents that collectively form part of the Constitution. Some of those documents are Acts of Parliament, others are court decisions, others are constitutional conventions, that is to say, unwritten laws that are not enforceable in court, but they are customs and traditions that have evolved over the years. So this is a monumental piece of legislation. You may not be able to see this in all parts of the room, but I'll summarise what's on the screen there. That is taken from a British governmental publication. What devolution did was, it ensured that on the one hand, there was a transfer of power from London to Edinburgh in relation to fields such as education, agriculture, fishing, crime, emergency services, some features of transport, and so on. But on the other hand, certain reserved powers were left in the hands of the institutions of government in London. The reserved powers included those to do with defence, the armed forces, and crucially, taxation. That was the original idea in 1998 with the Scotland Act. We had a new Scotland Act in 2012, which headed even further in the direction of devolution. And astonishingly enough, in the last few days of the referendum campaign, when one or two opinion polls suggested that the Scottish nationalists might win, the three party leaders in London came together and issued what they called a vow, a promise, to transfer even more powers from London to Scotland. And if those promises are fulfilled, the United Kingdom is heading in the direction of federation or quasi-federation, or what someone else has described as neo-federation. Whichever label you pin on it, the United Kingdom has changed dramatically since 1998, and if, and it's a big if, this vow is implemented, the United Kingdom will change even more as the years proceed. I ought to say a word or two about the judiciary, because I am a lawyer by profession, although no longer practicing. The post-1998 devolution arrangements did not generally disturb the Scottish legal system, which had predated the creation of the devolved organs of government in Scotland. Remember, Scotland had previously been an independent country prior to its union with the United Kingdom in after the Acts of Union of 1707. So there was a pre-existing judicial system in Scotland. Having said that, the judiciary, primarily through the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, has become the guardian of the devolution arrangements, and the Westminster Parliament in London has remained the sovereign legislature of the United Kingdom as a whole. So it's a mess, really. And this is what happens when you don't have a written constitution, number one, and number two, this is what happens when you engage in piecemeal, step-by-step constitutional reform without any overarching program or system. It's very British. It's good in one sense because it allows the constitution to grow organically, and that has its advantages. But on the other hand, you end up with what I will later describe as a constitutional quagmire, because things have been allowed to grow in a haphazard way. So let me now move on to more recent times. So that was what occurred in 1998. Initially, Labour and the other pro-union parties, that is to say Labour and the Liberal Democrats, were able to check the Scottish National Party in the first few years of the Scottish Parliament and what became the Scottish Government north of what's called the border, the internal border between Scotland and England. But there was an interim, a Scottish National Party-led government for a while in Scotland, but in 2011, the Scottish National Party, led by the astonishing politician known as Alex Salmond, managed to secure an overall majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, and thus the Scottish National Party was able to seize control of the Scottish government. That was in 2011. And using what he claimed to be a mandate from the electorate, Alex Salmond ran rings round Mr. Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and he managed to negotiate the Edinburgh Agreement. That was an agreement between the Scottish government and the United Kingdom government. It was a government that paved the way to the independence referendum. And Mr. Cameron, regrettably, made a number of concessions which came very close to bringing the United Kingdom to an end. And I'll explain to you how and why that happened now, before we draw some lessons which we can apply in Cyprus and elsewhere. So one of the things that occurred was that, for example, the United Kingdom government effectively conceded control to the Scottish government over the referendum process. What did that mean in practice? It meant that the United Kingdom government recognised that there was a right to self-determination for the Scottish people. But on the other hand, it meant that the Scottish government could determine what is meant by the Scottish people and who could vote in the referendum. And the way things unfolded meant that people called Kyriakides and Dimitriadis and others who were not born in Scotland were given the right to vote because they happened to live and work in Scotland. And people called MacDougall or Cameron or with other Scottish names who had been born in Scotland but happened to live in England were denied the vote. It was an astonishing state of affairs, and my university has a number of employees who were Scottish, And I spoke to a number of them in the run-up to the referendum, and they felt bitterly resentful that my relatives and friends could vote, having been born in London, and they, who had been born in Glasgow or Edinburgh, but happened to be living in another part of the United Kingdom, had been denied a vote. The other thing that happened, which was shocking, and I would argue improper, even though the relevant legislation was enacted, was that Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party and First Minister for Scotland, managed to arrange for school children aged 16 and 17 to vote in the referendum. Now, in general elections in the United Kingdom, you have to be 18 and over to vote. But Alex Salmond arranged, and Mr. Cameron allowed him to arrange for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. So Mr. Cameron, looking back on it, made concessions, and the concessions very nearly brought the United Kingdom to its end. Thankfully, and I speak as somebody who supported the no, thankfully 55% of Scottish voters chose to vote no, and that is to say in favour of the Union. Now, I'm not a psephologist, but I understand from the psephologists who have been commentating that it was the older voters who may have helped the United Kingdom stay in place. So the Scottish nationalists are saying, let's wait for those the 15 and 16-year-olds to become 16 and 17, and the older generation to pass out, as it were, and then we can have a referendum in a few years' time. Who knows? My point, though, is this is what happens when you don't have a written constitution, you make concessions, and you allow the voters in a country, or the voting system in a country, to be manipulated for political ends. Now, I'm going to draw some lessons, but I want to just preface my remarks as regards the lessons by emphasising that there are profound differences between the north of the United Kingdom, that is to say Scotland, and the north of Cyprus, the occupied north of Cyprus, which is known as, in inverted commas, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. There aren't crucial differences. First of all, Scotland had previously been part of the United Kingdom. It had previously been an independent country before becoming part of the United Kingdom pursuant to a Scottish Act of Parliament. So that doesn't apply in the occupied north of Cyprus. Secondly, Scotland does not have a population consisting of colonists. It might have a few illegal immigrants, but it doesn't have colonists who've been brought over in breach of the Geneva Conventions. Scotland has not been subject, at least in recent times, to any war crimes, hasn't been subject to genocide, it hasn't been subject to ethnic cleansing. It has lawfully established devolved organs of government. The rule of law, by and large, functions. The judiciary upholds the rule of law. Alex Salmond, whatever his faults, was elected to the Scottish Parliament, and through the Scottish arrangements, he was duly elected as the leader of the Scottish government as First Minister. The government of the United Kingdom recognises the Scottish government. That doesn't apply here with the Republic of Cyprus and the Turkish occupied north. So there are profound differences. Nonetheless, the primary reason why I objected to both the Annan Plan and the proposed independence of Scotland was because I am against the principle of partition. Whether it's partition in the form of the carving up of a single sovereign state into two, or the carving up of a sovereign state along so-called bizonal, bicommunal federal lines, as the Annan Plan of 2004 attempted to do here in Cyprus. So there are differences between the two. Let's now look at the lessons of history, or some of the lessons of history. And I'm going to just focus on 5 in the last remaining 20 minutes or so. The first lesson of history reflects an immortal truth. If and when constitutional power is transferred away from the central government of a sovereign state to one or more regions, pursuant to devolution or federalization, and if such a transfer of power is accompanied by the establishment or maintenance of an internal border of one description or another, then adverse consequences may follow. To begin with, the inhabitants on each side of that internal border may develop politically, economically, and culturally in different ways, while their ties of common citizenship may become diluted and the authority of the organs of central government may be weakened. In a thoughtful article published in The Spectator magazine on the 13th of September, that's just a few days before the referendum, Sean Thomas articulated this truth in vivid terms, which are, I think, highly relevant to Cyprus. Once you put, this is what Mr. Thomas said, once you put a frontier in place, then two peoples, however alike, will grow apart, even if they use the same language. A phony partition becomes a real partition over time. Eventually, the cultures diverge so far they can never be truly rejoined. Mr. Thomas was talking about Scotland there, which is part of a United Kingdom which shares a common language and by and large shares a common religion, although we are a multi-ethnic, pluralist democracy in the United Kingdom with multiple faiths. But if the United Kingdom can grow apart from Scotland and come to the verge of partition, then I wonder what's going to happen here in Cyprus if there is ever a so-called bizonal, bicommunal federation with one side primarily speaking one language and sharing one faith, and the other side speaking another language and sharing another faith. Two sides can grow apart very, very quickly, as we've seen since 1998 in Scotland. In this context, secessionist or separatist or dissolutionist movements are much more likely to come to power in countries which are divided by an internal border. In fact, one of the interesting things about the Scottish referendum debate was the question of what would happen if there was a yes. It was unclear whether Scotland would secede, break away and secede. It was unclear whether Scotland and the United Kingdom would separate. And it was unclear whether or not the United Kingdom would have to be dissolved with two new states emerging in their place. And you had similar arguments here, I understand, in 2004 over the Annan Plan. And it was unclear. The British government went more in the direction of secession, if in the event of a yes vote. But this is the mess that you can find yourself in once you start tampering with your constitution and once you turn a unitary state into a federal or quasi-federal state. A good point was made in the Financial Times in the run-up to the referendum by Philip Stevens, the commentator of the Financial Times. He said that Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party, has reawakened the allegiance of the tribe. So tribalism is another consequence of breaking up a country in the way that the United Kingdom has broken up. And this is the sort of stuff that Alex Salmond has been promoting. First of all, when devolution was introduced, we used to refer to the Scottish Executive. The Scottish Executive has now been renamed as the Scottish Government, with the Scottish flag, not the United Kingdom flag, the Scottish flag as the primary emblem of Scotland. And moves were afoot to prepare the ground for independence. There wasn't just a referendum campaign in favour of independence. Alex Salmond and his colleagues were actively preparing the ground. And you can see there that one of the steps that was taken. A consultation exercise was introduced on preparing an interim constitution for Scotland. The referendum closes on the 20th of October. I wonder whether it will go ahead or not. But I got that out of the Scottish Government website this morning, I think it was. So the Scots are still living in the hope of bringing about independence. There's a positive lesson for Cyprus to draw here, and that's consultation. Insofar as I'm aware, please correct me if I'm wrong, no documents have been produced by the United Nations to facilitate a consultation exercise as regards the negotiations here in Nicosia. Has any consultation exercise been instigated to enable you, the citizens of Cyprus, to see what is being negotiated in your name? No. There's never been, yeah.
Who you call Constitutional Assembly?
Yeah. Thank you. The Scottish devolution experiment was preceded by what was called a constitutional convention, but which was, to all intents and purposes, a constitutional assembly. And the whole process was characterised by consultation. Both the British government consulted and the Scottish government consulted. There was transparency. The law officers, the legal advisors of the British government, gave lectures and published transcripts and published papers setting out their interpretation of some of the legal issues that were presented. Has the Attorney General of the Republic done something similar as regards any draft papers that are floating around Nicosia? Now, we can draw lessons from this, because it's not all bad. I'm painting a negative picture, but there are some positive principles to draw from Scotland, and that is an example. The use of consultation exercises to facilitate transparency, to facilitate public participation, and to enable us, the citizens, to hold the politicians to account, and to ensure that constitutions are made, or any future constitution is made, in as robust and good way as possible. Let me just move on now to the second lesson of history. It's well known, but rarely applied. And it's this: dangers flow from any policy of appeasement. I've skated over the history of the United Kingdom since 1998, and it's been characterized by one act of appeasement and one concession after another. And the concessions have been largely one way, from London to Edinburgh, not the other way around. It's easy to say this with the benefit of hindsight, but there was indeed a problem with the governance of Scotland before devolution. Scotland was governed by and large from London, and it was governed badly from London, which is one reason why there was a demand for a Scottish government and a Scottish parliament. But it's one thing to govern badly, to govern well, and in hindsight, it's easy to say it. What Scotland needed was better government from London, not devolved government from Edinburgh. And that's a lesson that we can draw from this whole episode. Related to that, and I think this is equally important, if not more so, what the concessions and what the appeasement did was not satisfy the appetite of the Scottish nationalists, but it made them even more hungry. It whetted their appetite, and it encouraged them in the demand for partition and for independence. The Labour politicians who were promoting devolution were describing devolution as the destination. This is what we're going to produce. We're going to give you a Scottish Parliament, a Scottish government within the United Kingdom, and away you go. Run your own affairs, subject to the reserved powers in favour of London. That was the dream of Labour back in '98. But the reality was that the Scottish nationalists saw devolution as merely a stepping stone en route to partition. The title, I haven't put it on the screen, but I owe the title of this lecture, The Slippery Slope from Devolution to Independence. I owe this title to a cartoon written or prepared by Nicholas Garland in the Daily Telegraph on the 25th of July 1997, where he effectively showed the Scottish flag with 3 Labour politicians slipping down from devolution to independence. And that's sometimes the cartoonists back in 1997 were ahead of the curve. They could see where this was heading. Another person who could see where this was heading was Margaret Thatcher, whose government from 1979 to, 1990, generated an enormous amount of antipathy towards Scotland. But even she, towards the end of her life, could foresee that devolution would head towards partition. So that's the second lesson of history. Do not engage in appeasement. And I can't resist drawing attention to what Winston Churchill said about appeasement, he, of course, being the great enemy of appeasement during the 30s. An appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. This brings me to the third lesson of history. There are 5 in total. Here's the third. States which become constitutionally divided, or allow themselves to become constitutionally divided, along religious, sectarian, ethnic, or other lines, are much more prone to become partitioned or otherwise divided than integrated, pluralist and multi-ethnic democracies. In pluralist multi-ethnic democracies, constitutional power is normally vested in the citizens as a whole, and each citizen is treated equally, irrespective of religion, sect, or ethnic origin. What we've done in the United Kingdom is move from being an integrated whole to being fragmented into 4 pieces. So there's a separate electorate in Scotland, a separate electorate in Wales, a separate electorate in Northern Ireland, a separate electorate in England. There are devolved organs of government in 3 of the 4 units of the United Kingdom. And what we've now done is we've reawakened what was described a moment or 2 ago as tribalism. In Northern Ireland, we see, of course, a different story played out between Catholics and Protestants. We've seen that same sectarian clash emerging in Glasgow over the past few days. We've seen it at Rangers and Celtic football matches. But this move towards devolution has created tensions, not created tensions, exacerbated pre-existing tensions, and see them come to the fore to a far greater extent. My fear here in Cyprus is once you, instead of integrating Cyprus, and I'm an idealist, but sometimes idealists are proven right, and hopefully I will be. And if I'm not, you can hold me to it. But the future for Cyprus surely lies in having an integrated, pluralist, multi-ethnic democracy which respects every religion, every community, every faith. Bicommunalism is out of date. There aren't 2 communities anymore in Cyprus. There's a Jewish community now. There are Armenians. There are Catholics. There are Buddhists. Every religion is represented here in Cyprus. And for us to be talking about 2 communities is to be talking in the language of the past. But if we establish a so-called bizonal, bicommunal federation, we are just heading ourselves in the direction of the United Kingdom, where each side, another phrase that's drawn from the lexicon of bicommunalism, each so-called side will head in different directions, culturally, politically, economically, and spiritually. And the lesson of the United Kingdom is that is catastrophic, and it will lead to partition sooner or later in a different way than one might first envisage. I must cite here, and I'm conscious of the time, and I'd like to finish in 10 minutes. I was really taken by the remarks of Dominic Sandbrook in the Daily Mail. Now, because I'm in Cyprus, I have to buy the Daily Mail, partly because it's cheaper, and secondly because it's everywhere. And on Saturday, look at the headline, the Daily Mail, now home rule for England. This is tribalism. The English are now saying, hang on, the Scots have had a referendum, we want a referendum. The Scots were given devolved organs of government, we want devolved organs of government. The Scots received more pounds per Scot than the English from the British taxpayer. We want more money. So tribalism, English tribalism is coming to the fore. I'll come to what Dominic Sandbrook said in a moment or 2. The Mail on Sunday says, the Prime Minister warns Ed being Ed Miliband, the leader of the opposition, don't sell out England. So even the Prime Minister's engaging in tribalism here. We've got an election coming up as well. That's maybe one of the reasons. But anyway, what Dominic Sandbrook said, he's a historian, what he said in the Daily Mail on Saturday was the following. The campaign has been a terrible warning about the curse of nationalism and the dreadful dangers of a new politics based on crude populist appeals to the powerless and the alienated. The deeper lesson of the referendum campaign, especially when you consider the rise of separatist movements in Catalonia and Ukraine and elsewhere, is that the threat of nationalism is just as real today as in the era of the 2 world wars. I'll make 2 points as a follow-up to that. The first is that there is a connection of some sort between the rise of Scottish nationalism and the recession and the banking crash and the economic troubles that we've had in the United Kingdom since the collapse of various banks, including the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Halifax Bank of Scotland. Alex Salmond and the Scottish nationalists have tapped into a deep well of resentment that has been generated by the financial catastrophe generated by the banks. And that's a warning for other European Union member states that are gripped by recession or adversely affected by the Eurozone. We in the UK are outside the Eurozone, but we've had our own economic and financial miseries. So economic misery gives rise to nationalism. The second point I'll make is that in spite of, the second point I'll make is that the rise of Scottish nationalism has arisen in parallel and in different circumstances to the rise of Islamism over the last few years. It was interesting listening to the BBC News in the run-up to the referendum. They were switching from the Scottish referendum campaign to the rise of Islamism in Iraq and Syria and Libya, on the one hand, but in the United Kingdom itself. And I could sense the politicians didn't want to connect the two, especially when the Scottish gentleman was executed by beheading on our doorstep. Yes, there is a... we've seen, unfortunately, the devastating consequences of the potent mixture of nationalism and Islamism in the case of the occupied North. Look at the name of the regime in the North. It's the so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. It's not the Republic of Northern Cyprus. They chose that first word, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And of course, if you look at the constitution of the Republic of Cyprus dated 1960, a Muslim is defined as a Turk. And we've seen now in recent years the emergence of this phrase, the Muslim Turkish Cypriot, the desecularization of the Turkish Cypriots. Mr. Davutoglu, the new Prime Minister of Turkey, uses that phrase, the Muslim Turkish Cypriots. Now I can't resist making this point as well. The regime in the occupied North is the product of an illegal unilateral declaration of independence, and that regime is religiously flavored, and that regime is unrecognized on the world stage. I can't resist saying it. The so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant is unrecognized on the world stage. It's the product of a unilateral declaration. It is also the product of genocide in the same way as the regime in the occupied North is. And the regime in the North, of course, is a product of appeasement. Appeasement from here in Nicosia and appeasement in Washington, London, Brussels, and elsewhere. And that's what happens when you engage in appeasement. You might engage in short-term satisfaction, but in the long term it can prove catastrophic, as the United Kingdom and the United States are now facing in this part of the world. Fortunately, Scotland has not gone down the path of procuring or proclaiming a unilateral declaration of independence, and that's partly because Mrs. Thatcher and her administration in 1983 had the sense to support the United Nations declaration, United Nations resolution, which branded the regime in the occupied North as illegal. And I have no doubt that Alex Salmond may well have toyed with the idea of declaring a unilateral, making a unilateral declaration of independence in Scotland, and if he did have some thoughts, his legal advisors would have told him there are precedents to the contrary that you ought to be aware of, one of which is Cyprus. So you can see how you've got to be very careful in international relations and when you engage in constitutional reform. I'll whiz through my last two lessons of history. The fourth, I've already drawn attention to. Nationalists inclined towards manipulating election laws and thereby manipulating electoral rolls to their advantage. I've made the point earlier, so I won't dwell on that. And you're all familiar with the manipulation of the voting here at the time of the Annan Plan in the occupied North. The fifth and final lesson of history, and this is a more positive lesson, is that there are merits associated with a referendum which focuses on the acceptability or otherwise of a philosophical proposition. In Scotland, there was no fully fledged plan presented to the population in the way that there was here in 2004. What was put to the population in Scotland was a philosophical question. Do you think that Scotland should be an independent country? In the event of a yes vote, and there wasn't, of course, but in the event of a yes vote, then a plan would have been put together. And some commentators were saying, well, there should have been, in that situation, there would have had to be a second referendum to approve any plan. Here in Cyprus, they put the cart before the horse in 2004. They cobbled together this agreement, this Annan Plan, in secret from the top down. It was rushed into print and then presented to the population. What should have happened, again, it's easier said than done, is the philosophical question should have been put first. Do you think that Cyprus should become a bizonal, bicommunal federation? In the event of a yes, then you prepare the plan. In the event of a no, you do something else. So there's a lesson to be drawn here, and maybe that ought to be thought about here in Cyprus. I now come to my conclusions. On this occasion, and that's partly thanks to the United Kingdom's campaigning, on this occasion, the United Kingdom has been saved and Scotland has not had to face the economic and other costs flowing from any partition. Those are the statistics that were promoted by the British government in London as to the costs of any partition in the United Kingdom. The recent history of the United Kingdom has exposed the dangers associated with any decentralisation of power away from the central organs of government. It doesn't matter whether such decentralisation takes place pursuant to devolution or pursuant to federalisation. The follies of federation will arise nonetheless. And I suppose they can be summarised under what I would call the 5 Fs. The first F is fragmentation. And we've seen in the United Kingdom that the United Kingdom has been fragmented by devolution. Here in Cyprus, if there's a bizonal, bicommunal federation, Cyprus won't, of course, be fragmented into 2. It will be fragmented into 4, because you'll still have 2 sovereign base areas on the southern coast, even if they're truncated. So devolution or federalisation results in fragmentation. Number 2, decentralisation may give rise to increased factionalism. And I've given you an example from the newspapers of the United Kingdom. Number 3, decentralisation may give rise to allegations of favouritism. Why does Scotland receive more money than England? I can envisage something similar happening here. Number 4, decentralisation may generate friction between the various fragments of a sovereign state and within each fragment of a sovereign state. We're already seeing now the Labour Party and the Conservatives having a political punch-up over how to provide for English votes for English voters. So friction is a natural consequence. Not always, but it's often a natural consequence from federation. And as a combined result of the above, decentralisation may ensure that a sovereign state becomes inherently fragile. I end by drawing attention to an irony, and the irony relates to these 2 island states at opposite corners of the European Union. That image, I think, of the European Union amidst Croatia, so my apologies to any Croatians in the audience here today. But here we have the European Union, and at 2 opposing ends we have 2 island states, the United Kingdom and Cyprus. On the one hand, the United Kingdom has been spared the ordeal of being partitioned de jure, thanks to the 55% of Scottish voters who voted no. On the other hand, the United Kingdom faces a constitutional future which may be characterised by federalism or quasi-federalism. On the other hand, the Republic of Cyprus is striving to overturn its de facto, in other words, illegal partition, by embracing a form of federalism built upon bicommunalism, bizonalism, and a phrase that was coined by the Turkish government in 1958, intellectual partition. That's a subject for another day. My response to this irony is to contend that both the United Kingdom and the Republic of Cyprus have no tradition of federalism. And for this and multiple other reasons, both the United Kingdom and the Republic of Cyprus are heading in the wrong direction. Unless they change direction, each state will end up in a constitutional quagmire of its own making, with even more layers of bureaucracy, but much less effective governance. Such a bureaucratic and multi-governmental state of affairs is the last thing that citizens want, but no less importantly, it's the last thing that established businesses or potential investors want to see. Remember, investors want stability, not uncertainty. In short, if federalism or quasi-federalism is accomplished in either the United Kingdom or Cyprus, a Pandora's box will be opened with potentially destructive consequences for all concerned. All of which brings me neatly to the final lesson of history. It's the most simple of all, and it is this: prevention is better than cure. Thank you.